All right, hello everyone. Welcome to another session of our Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Jenny Liu. I am the Urban Studies and Planning faculty in charge of the seminar this term, along with my colleague, Dr. Kelly Clifton, back there from Civil Engineering. And today we're very happy to have Dr. Jeff Ban here from University of Washington, and he is going to be talking about network congestion effect of e-hailing transportation services, but his general research interests are very much broader than that and include transportation networks, system modeling, simulation, urban traffic modeling, operations, big data, shared mobility, intelligent transportation systems, and so on and so forth. So I'm very happy to turn the floor over to Dr. Ban.
Thank you, Jenny, and good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here, and thanks for the invitation. So what I'm going to talk about is basically some very preliminary research about our modeling of the e-hailing services in urban areas, and also some of the future directions that we think might be important in this line. So for that, I really appreciate if you ask me questions either during my talk or after the seminar for the discussion. So with that, I'd like to first acknowledge my co-authors and students, Dr. Junxi Pang and Dr. Majid Disuki from University of Southern California. We jointly wrote a paper and we did the research. Started about 2 years ago. And the paper is under review. So what I'm going to talk about today mainly based on that paper. Also my graduate students from UW. And this research kind of funded by the ISF grant. Those grants are not exactly on the topic, but related. So I just try to mention that. So maybe I should move here. I like to start with the, we all know that transportation has been going a lot of new developments and in terms of systems and technologies. And I like to start with those. I think many of us are already familiar with those, right? So I like to kind of group them into vehicle particularly oriented and also vehicle plus transportation. So we start with gasoline vehicles, right? We all know that. This is still the dominant kind of mode of cars. And then hybrid vehicles, then electric vehicles, okay? New energy vehicles. Those are particularly similar. So instead of using gasoline vehicles, we use other type of alternative kind of energy sources for cars, for vehicles. And then autonomous vehicles, right? So this is a hot topic that's been talked about in many areas and by many people. And then drones, that has been widely tested and has been applied in many disciplines in civil and other areas. So they've been using for inspecting bridges and the highways, and some places people started to experiment with, can we use drones to monitor traffic and study to look at something like that. And flying cars, those are kind of still on the news, right, media, and but there are still serious stuff like Uber is doing some work on that, right? So this is some of the developments I'm trying to summarize in terms of vehicle technologies. And on the other hand, if you look at vehicle plus transportation, particularly the communication aspect of this, I'm not sure how many of you have seen this in real life. I never did, but this is certainly in the old days, people can make a phone call in their cars, right? Some of the high-end maybe cars. And then later on, the cell phone became, widely, everybody has a cell phone, they can make a phone call. And of course, later on, we found out it's not very safe. It's banned, but you can still use your AirSip to make some phone calls in most places in this country. And then the mobile sensing, it's actually a widely deployed, kind of technologies, including cell phones and other technologies that, like navigation systems, that try to kind of track in certain sense, people's movements and gets information from that. So we've been working in the past for this and mainly using the data for traffic purposes. And then connected vehicles, right? Those are vehicles talking to each other and talking to the infrastructure and try to use that for safety and mobility and other purposes. Okay? So new social media is also part of the game, and they are basically make everybody connected. Okay, not only before the trip, but sometimes also during the trip en route, that they can make some decisions. And then the shared mobility, like Uber and other type of companies, has been trying to leverage on this and use this really to change the urban transportation services. So this is sort of another trend of technology and system development in transportation, particularly in terms of communications. But what's the future transportation look like? The future means not tomorrow or 5 years from now, but very long horizon. So we have this autonomous driving. We have the flying vehicles. I don't know when that will become practical, but that's still something in the horizon. And then we have this shared mobility kind of platform that bring everything together, right? So what's the future look like? This is some of the questions I always ask in my introduction to transportation class, right? So have you ever seen this? Yeah, nodding. Yeah, so this, you saw your age of so this is the Fifth Element movie, right? So if you haven't seen this, I highly recommend you go to YouTube. You can see this. This is free now, and you can watch the movie. It's pretty fun to watch. So I'm not going to talk about all everything here, but mainly the shared mobility angle of this and some of our research on this, right? So a key aspect of shared mobility, to my understanding, is this e-hailing services. Try to provide a platform that can kind of connect customers and drivers better and more efficient, right? So that's what we're trying to focus on. Particularly, we're going to look at the system impact or network impact of those kind of services, how that will influence your transportation system as a whole. So from there, I would like to start with some very basic concepts in this whole area of research. It's essentially started with the question like how the traffic is distributed in your urban network, right? So it sounds like probably purely random, right? So the cars coming from all over places and they go to who knows where, and it creates the congestion, right? But as a matter of fact, people make rational decisions, right? We are humans, right? We travel by a car or by bus for a reason. Those are rational decisions, and those rational decisions can be modeled, can be captured, can be studied, right? So essentially, for everyday travel, you are facing all kinds of decisions, okay? Some of them, like I come to Portland State for the second time, for the campus the first time. So everything is new. I really need to go through all these decisions. Where I'm going, which route, and where I'm parking, right? So although Google Map can help me to do most of those tasks now, but I still need to make a decision, from time to time. If you are a commuter, then your decisions most likely fixed day to day. Then those kind of decisions is more like in the back of your mind, okay? But in any case, this would be a process that you have to make for your travel. So for this, there's a very classical area in transportation called transportation network modeling or traffic assignment, whatever you call it. It's basically try to predict the flow distribution on network. Could be only cars, could be multimodal in terms of buses and other flows or trucks, by understanding people's behavior and then try to predict the flow patterns. Okay? So it started very early in 1924 by Frank Kite. So this equilibrium concept is very key to this kind of analysis. So in 1924, as I mentioned, Frank started this, but later on, it was Waldrop in 1952 proposed these two principles. So the first one is regarding to kind of suspect, people are selfish, right? When they make their travel decisions, they only consider their own cost or benefit, right? They're not considering the others on the road, okay? But oftentimes, from a transportation manager perspective, you would consider how I'm going to operate my system in order to be the most efficient, not for individual person, but as a whole for the transportation system. That's give you two principles or two perspectives when you look at this. So we mainly focus on the first one for this talk. And from there, you basically have this so-called user equilibrium concept. If everybody is kind of selfish, or the system optimum, or we try to collaborate or cooperate for the benefit of the whole system. So you have these two perspectives, and then later on we realized that a more realistic way is to assume that we have different group of users in a system. We have individual drivers, we have the transit systems, we have freight carriers, we have taxi operators, we have Uber drivers. So different groups, they have their own objectives and decisions. And it's more like a mixed system, right? So you can still reach certain kind of equilibrium in the long term, but they're not purely for the individual person or purely for the system per se. So you have different kind of views on this. And there have been argument over the years, especially in the last 10 or even 5 years, regarding if those concepts are relevant for transportation network analysis. So in my view, it is still, maybe even more, because the reason is very simple. There are two reasons. First, the technologies and systems makes the prediction and estimation of traffic states or estimation or prediction of people's behavior better, right? We talk about big data, we talk about analytics. Google can predict very well the traffic conditions for you, right? So presenting this information to the users, to the drivers, will give them better decisions, okay? Secondly, there are platforms, because of the communication, because of the connectivity, that you have more ways to influence people's decisions. From the way that you could benefit either individuals or benefit the system. For example, if autonomous vehicle is widely used, we are kind of disengaged from driving, right? And you can imagine then there's ways or better ways than the autonomous algorithm can incorporate some of those ideas and influence people to either select their driving routes or pick their mode that maybe benefit the system, right? Reduce the emissions, reduce the fuel consumptions, right? So those new systems will make those more relevant in my understanding. You're okay to have different opinions, and I'm welcome to have comments and discussions, but that's what we view this as a whole. Going back to the e-hailing services, so we know that it started, in the old days we have phone calls to call taxi, right, to pick you up, but in the kind of the modern era, it's more like mobile apps, right? Either Uber or many other the so-called shared mobility services, they basically use these mobile apps. But in the future, there may be other ways, connected autonomous, things can be done even more, automatically. So I'm showing you three, at least to my understanding, very widely used shared mobility services. We all know this. I'm supposed to use the mouse. Sorry. So you use Uber, right? Lyft. This we are all familiar with. And Didi, many of you are probably not familiar, but this is similar to Uber company in China. So the unique feature of this Didi company is they integrate both shared mobility like Uber type and also taxi services. Okay, they integrate them in the same platform. So those services basically provide different modes of transportation, as you can imagine. So firstly, you have e-hailing taxi. As I mentioned, Didi actually integrate taxi services, and you can hail a taxi from that platform, okay, if you like. Okay? Or you talk about these so-called TNCs, right? Those Uber or Lyft, we all sometimes call them TNCs. There are different names for them, but I tend to use this for this particular talk. They provide ride sourcing services. To date, I'm still believe this is a primary kind of service they provide. Ride sourcing means drivers are for hire. They provide you the service. If you are a single rider, it's basically similar to taxi. It's no difference, right? Except it's more convenient, it's cheaper in many cases, but still the same thing. They could also provide ride sharing in other, platforms, maybe not covered widely by these three, but some small platforms just for matching up people for carpooling or van pooling. In the Bay Area, in the Seattle area, they have the van pool program. For if you work in the same company, like 6 or up to 6 or even more people, you can drive the same car from home to work, right? So those are kind of ride sharing services. And also, you can combine the two, right? You have the for hire drivers, but you have multiple people from different locations. That's widely used by Uber Pool and Lyft Rideshare and some other services. Okay, so you have different mode of services. So what are the impact of those services? Okay, and as you can imagine, it's the same for any new technologies. It has plus and pros and cons, right? So what are the positives for this kind of services? And the first argument may be cheaper, right? So lower cost. At least now, because they're still burning money, so it's make it cheaper. And also it's more convenient. Okay, so you can easily match a car, and it's less waiting time, and et cetera, right? Also, it's have the platform and opportunity for people to match up for ride sharing. Uber Pool, right? So Lyft Rideshare. Didi has its own program to encourage people for lower cost. Okay, if you live nearby, you can use that. So give you the opportunity, right? Promote people to do that. It reduces the searching for parking traffic in urban areas. So there were research in the past talking about 30% of urban traffic was circling around for parking. I'm not sure how accurate that number is, but there are significant number of, a percentage of traffic that's for parking purposes. So that can reduce that, right? You don't need to drive your own car. You don't need to park. Another thing is with the e-hailing, many of the taxi or the Uber drivers, they don't need to driving around to look for customers. They can park even their car somewhere and wait for the next, messages or next call for services. That reduces, the driving around for customer kind of traffic, right? Those are the, positives. I'm talking about this mainly from a customer, taxi driver's perspective. There are more, I believe, like economy and job related, right? So, but what are the negative impact? You've probably heard about that, many of us, right? The safety and the comfort concerns of those. There's many news items regarding the Uber drivers or what kind of things they have done and the traffic accidents and so on and so forth. So that's one. Also, so when you have the chance to call a taxi or Uber, how many of you would call Uber? With no question, I just call Uber. Maybe a third, of course. How many of you will call taxi? For no, well, nobody. How many of you would say it depends? Yeah, I see some hands. So I'm one of those. I can give you my own experience. So if I'm not under a pressure of time, I oftentimes call Uber. If my flight will take off in 4 hours, I'm going to the airport, I call Uber, right? So it's cheaper, right? So, but if I'm really under the pressure, my flight will take off in 2 hours, from my home to SeaTac airport. It's 30 minutes, but oftentimes it's 1 hour. So I will call a taxi, right? I believe many of us share the same kind of concern because we know taxi drivers are more experienced. They know the system better, okay? So, and another aspect is maybe 2 months ago, I was in a similar situation like this, but I was a host. I was inviting a very senior faculty to UW to give a seminar like this. And when I picked him up from the airport, I took an Uber there, but when I picked him up, I called a taxi because it's closer to the terminal, and I believe the driver is more reliable, right? Less kind of surprises. So you can see, it doesn't mean that taxi is wiped out by the Uber services. They have their own edge, right? They have their own competitiveness in this whole business. So we have to sort of capture that. Another thing is this vacant trips, right? So you have these for-hire services, but in many cases, these empty trips, like, it's kind of, you cannot avoid that, right? So I can show you that only under very perfect situation that you don't have any empty trips. Otherwise, you will always have that. Ultimately, those kind of services are easier, cheaper, more convenient. That lead to what? More use of them. Okay. So in many cities, they're competing with transit, especially for the so-called, first last mile problems, and also you are, generate more demand. Previously I can walk or ride a bike. Now, Uber is so cheap. I just call Uber $5. I was doing my sabbatical at UCLA 2 years ago when we started this research. From the UCLA campus to one of the, shopping places, it's about a couple miles, right? So in the old days, people would take bus. But when I was there, unfortunately, I took Uber all the time. It's only $6. If you have another friend or two with you, it's everybody like $2 or $3. It's similar with the transit, right? It's more convenient. It's door-to-door service. So you see the competition between this kind of services with transit, which we consider more efficient for urban systems. So we always have this kind of, it's in some sense it's a zero-sum game, right? So somebody took more than the others will take less. So we always need to look for this kind of aspect. All right. So there might be others that I don't want to talk too much. So when we talk about, so that's why it's important to look at what's the impact of those kind of services. You can imagine it's very complex, right? It's not like just one answer that fits all the scenarios. But if you look at the literature, it's relatively new, of course, but the methods, to my understanding, can be classified into two major groups. One is data, empirical studies. You look at data and see what's the impact, right? How the Uber services compare with taxis and other services. So there are a couple studies I listed here based on data from New York City, from Didi in China, and from particularly a taxi data in Shenzhen, also from China. So some of the major findings, we don't have time to go through all of those, but some of the major findings, particularly by a recent paper just published by Transportation Research Part C, summarizing some of those major kind of findings on this. One is these new services can mildly increase congestion. Okay, that's of course using the data from one city, but it probably has some commonality with other cities. And also, traditional taxi has its own edge in terms of competing with Uber services, like rush hours, like some other scenarios that we just talked about. Also, at the beginning of these new services, taxi kind of lose market, but then after a while it stabilizes. So it's sort of equilibrium between among different services that you can imagine. So there's other research that mainly work on the data plus modeling. So they use data, but try to understand the behavior and interactions, and then come up with some models. Use the data to calibrate those models. So this started with the traditional taxis. This group of researchers from Hong Kong. They started almost 20 years ago, and the research is still ongoing. It has many similarities with the new services of e-hailing. And for the e-hailing services, it's, again, relatively new. There's some papers. There's more of that I only listed two, but what I'm going to talk about only the work by us recently. So, okay, in about 15 minutes, I'm going to show you how we did this, very preliminary sense. Mainly talk about how we model different players in the systems and how we capture their behavior and interactions. So, in essence, what we are trying to capture is multiple players interact. They have their own choice behaviors and decisions in the same urban system or urban networks, right? So what are the major players? We have the so-called solo drivers, like me today, right? I drove from Seattle to Portland, just myself, okay? There'll be service providers, either taxi drivers or TNC drivers. Those are for hire services, right? They certainly have different perspectives with a solo driver, right? And also customers, right? Customers can call or pick between solo drivers, between the taxi services or Uber services, right? So they certainly can make their own choices. And what are the criteria that they use to make those choices, right? So I'm going to start to look at some of the basic criteria and service decisions of those players, and hopefully, I can then give you some kind of preliminary numerical results for that, right? So for the service providers, their main consideration is profit maximization. I'm a taxi driver. I'm trying to make more money, right? That's totally makes sense. So how you do that? In order to model that, you have to look at how we get charged if we call a taxi or Uber service, right? So I'm not sure how many of you know, but the basic charging scheme is you have a fixed fare, right? And plus distance and time-based charge. It's across the board, but different cities have different rates for those. And also the driver has a cost, right? So I'm driving, instead of doing something else, there's an opportunity cost and some other related cost. I'm driving a car, I need to fill gas, there's distance-based cost, right? So there are costs based on time and distance, okay? So if I'm looking at this very simple scenario, right? So for example, for service M, could be taxi or could be Uber. I'm talking about destination of urban, travel demand or urban trip. So if the taxi driver drop off a customer at a destination, the car becomes vacant, right? So it has a chance to pick up the next customer. So if he or she decided to pick up a trip, which I call trip K, from origin to destination, then there's a so-called profit related to that, right? This profit, I call it R from J to pick up the service K, or the pair K, for one kind of service M. And there are this many people trying to use these kind of services, for example, right? So then your profit can be modeled. I apologize for this. I have a few slides that have some equations, right? But I try to don't try to understand or memorize all those notations. I try to explain you the big picture, right? So we have basically the fixed rate here, right? That's what you pay, the fixed rate, like many cities $1.5 or $2. And then this is a travel time-based revenue, and this is distance-based revenue. Okay? It's a parameter how much you charge per unit time or per unit distance. And minus the time-based cost and distance-based cost. So time-based cost means my opportunity cost of doing something else, or distance-based cost is my car discounted, my gas, my insurance, and things like that. So this is basically the charging or the profit structure. Then what's the model to capture those behavior of the services? So essentially, you try to decide in this scenario how many drivers of service mode M, like taxi or Uber, would willing to go from J to serve this OD pair, to serve those people from, let's see, downtown Portland to, I don't know where, maybe the port or somewhere, right? So how many drivers would like to serve this, right? So the decisions are how many people, and then ultimately how many of the demand they're going to serve. So you have this kind of, it's actually not very complicated. So the objective, it's an optimization problem. Objective is to minimize, to maximize the total profit of those drivers. But there are two types of constraints. The first one is showing you where these vacant taxis or Uber cars coming from. They are actually coming from how many people choosing this kind of service from other origins to this node as their destination, right? They drop off customers, they become vacant, can serve the next customer. This is what this tells you. Okay? So this constant basically says, I'm serving this, I have this origin destination, I have 100 people want to use Uber service, then I need to provide this many Uber cars to pick them up. Okay? This just, to kind of make, things work out. Right? So that's the model for the, basically the service providers. Okay? And also, the next one is the customers. How the customers make their own decisions, right? So to our customers, you and me, there's a so-called utility or disutility, right? Or cost, or, time, these kind of factors all considered as a so-called disutility, right? So a solo driver will pay, they have their travel time based, right? They're driving, they cannot do other things, and distance based, right? Their car need to pay insurance and gas, similar to the service provider drivers. There might be some fixed costs. I didn't include them here, but you could, like, I need to pay the toll from home to work. I need to pay the parking if I drive to work, right? So those are kind of like the fixed cost. So the service riders, which means I call Uber or call taxi, then my cost would be the fare I paid plus some kind of time I spend using these services. Okay, those are basically the first three terms are the fare you paid for the service, and then you have this travel time-based disutility. You are in a car for like 1 hour. This is something that you can use for other things. So there's also waiting. I wait for the car to come, right? So there's also some kind of cost on that. So the waiting model, I wouldn't go to lots of detail on this. Basically, it says the waiting time is the travel time of the car from where the car was to my place to pick me up, plus the matching time, right? Because there might be not enough Uber cars in the peak hours. I have to wait extra times. So this second term is just for that. So ultimately, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but that means as a customer, I'm picking different services in the sense that my disutility or my cost is the minimum. Okay? I pick Uber or pick taxi or by driving myself because that is my best option. Okay? But people, we have to recognize different people have different preference, different value of time, different opinion regarding, I'm comfortable to ride, a Uber or not. So that's why they have, we end up with different people pick up different services. Okay. So last one is the so-called congestion model, right? So imagine every customer makes their own choices of the service providers they would like to use. The service providers, the taxi drivers or Uber drivers, can also pick which origin or which place I'm going to go to pick up my customers. They don't have the flexibility or freedom to say, I can only serve this particular customer, right? They don't have the ability to do that. But they do have the ability to respond to certain calls. And they can go to certain places, particularly to, respond to certain call for services. So they do have their own choices to make. But once they pick up their customers or once they start to drive, everybody face the network traffic. They're trying to navigate the system to minimize their travel times or to minimize their cost. So there's a whole set of different considerations or decisions when they are just like you and me driving, right? This morning I started at 6 o'clock in the morning because I try to avoid the traffic in Seattle. So this kind of decisions is basically congestion related, and you can simply model them very similar fashion with the classical user equilibrium problems, right? So I do have the model here, but I don't want to bore you with all the notations and details. But one unique feature of this model is that, so if you consider origin here, right? This is O, okay. So this is, in the classical model, will be only the demand from this origin to all the destinations. Like you and me try to go to work or go to shopping. But in this model, because you have this empty service provider cars, they're trying to pick up other customers. So you have to consider those, which is a Z variable in your model. Because those are also adding to your traffic, right? We don't care if the congestion created, if it's basically solo driver driving or it's a taxi driver driving. It's just cars, it's adds to traffic, right? So it's the same thing in that scenario. So we have to consider them properly. So in the end, you have a so-called general equilibrium model, so which you have, as we have seen, like you have service providers could have different types, different groups. You have customers, they might have different groups too. And you have this congestion model that's interact or combine those different players. So you have multiple optimization models or equilibrium models, putting them together, but they are not independent. They interact by either congestion or by their decisions, by the cost factors. So it's not a simple optimization model. So it's you can a good analogy of this is this game, right? Multiplayer game, and you try to make certain kind of equilibrium. But the equilibrium is not guaranteed. It's only under certain conditions. So you can further analyze this and show some of those properties of the model. But what the model enables you to do is to kind of study the influence of different policies or charging schemes, how that change people's choices regarding different services, how that changed the congestion pattern of your system. So that's what this can help you to achieve. So in maybe 1 or 2 minutes, I show you basically the very preliminary results, as I mentioned. The first one is started with this very simple example, like we have only one origin and 3 destinations. So it's a very extreme scenario, simple, but kind of mimic the morning or afternoon commute, right? So if we morning commute, we go from all sort of suburbans to the city, right? So this is maybe the afternoon type of commute. So the demand is given, and we have about 9 links. We have these cost functions, what's the travel time, what's the speed, what's the capacity of the link, right? So those are, if you know traffic excitement, that's the typical kind of thing. So what's the charging scheme, right? This is one of the important consideration factors. How you model the the cost to call Uber or something. So we actually use the Seattle data. So I search online, you're going to see those kind of data elements. The most important are the fixed fare. M equals to 1 means taxi, 2 means Uber, right? So I think I made some modifications because I think the current maybe $2.7 and then $1.25 for Uber. So I just kind of round up them to 3 and 1.5. And also the time-based and distance-based fare. Those are all like public data. Okay, so I just use them, and later on I change them to kind of see how the performance of the model or the network would change with those different parameters. Okay, so I first use those parameters and solve my model and see how this would give me, right? So this tells me from 1 to 2, okay? So I actually have, most people will call taxi, and a tiny bit will call the TNCs, Uber services, because the cost of these two are equal and minimum, right? So their utility or cost will be minimum. But from 1 to 3, most people will drive by themselves. Okay? That's how it works. And from 1 to 4, most people will use the Uber services. Okay? So I have to say that this is not so-called unique. You could have some other patterns that give you the similar kind of conclusion here. Okay? So also shows you the number of paths from each OD pair. This is a simple scenario, so you can imagine mostly it's 1 or 2 passes. But this does enable you to do some kind of sensitivity analysis, like you change the parameter and see how the results change. So in general, all the parameters, or most of them, are cost related, right? Either you pay a fee or fixed charge, those are cost. So the general trend is if you increase that parameter and the usage of that mode will be reduced, which is totally understandable. But some parameters, the model or the results are more sensitive to some parameters than the others. Like the distance-based charging is more sensitive than the distance-based kind of utility of the customers. This one tells us some interesting results. So if you look at this, I have 2 scenarios. The first scenario is what I showed you, right? So you only have a demand from origin to destinations. No coming back, right? So I call them asymmetric demand patterns. So in this case, if you vary up parameters, you have, different customers pick different mode, then you can kind of summarize what's the percentage of these taxi and Uber services. I call them EHSP. It's e-hailing service providers. Whichever. And you can tell that with the increase of those kind of services, the congestion or the VMT increased accordingly. Okay? But if I have perfectly symmetric demand, which means I have demand from A to B, but exactly the same from B to A. Okay? Exactly symmetric. And you can tell that this curve has a peak, okay, at about 40% of the service providers, people use services. And once more people choose to use those services, the congestion effect goes down because you can match better with people. You reduce the so-called vacant trips in that case. Okay? So a better view of this is I'm trying to plot. This is a demand symmetry, like from 0 to 100%, from purely asymmetric to purely symmetric kind of demand patterns, versus how much percentage of travelers are using those kind of services. And you can tell if once this is 100%. So more people using the services and the demand is less symmetric, then the VMT increase is more. Okay, so that's one of the observations. So this is not only true for this one. I also tested this on the so-called Sioux network, which is probably the widely tested network in the network modeling community, right? So this is actually, I did do a Google search and see this is a real city of Sioux Falls, right? So this is, people have been using as a network of the city. So if you compare, I do find some similarities, but the details we can talk about if you're interested. But I picked 5 origins and 5 destinations just to test the idea. And you could get very similar results with the small network. I kind of ignore that, but only I want to show you is this similar plot with that previous 3D plot. Again, if the demand pattern is very asymmetric, which means the morning commute or afternoon commute, right? Or many people are using those services, then you can imagine the VMT increase is the largest. Okay, so this is some of the findings that we discovered by doing this research. So very quickly, so the first finding I would say is everything is complicated, right? If you try to look at the natural impact, consistent impact, it depends on a lot of things, like how you charge people, right? So the characteristics and choice behavior of the service providers, people, and also even the network geometry, and also the travel patterns, demand patterns of your system, right? So you can imagine one city might be different from the other city. Okay? So you cannot just say, oh, in one city in China, it's increased congestion, then must be increased congestion in this city. It might not be the case. Okay? But in general, the larger, the percentage of people using the services, and the lower the demand symmetry in your network, then probably larger the increase of the VMT. Okay? That's probably have this kind of trend. This implies that for certain trips, important trips like commute and some other scenarios, then we need to be careful about how we manage those kind of services. Okay, so because in those kind of scenarios, the demand patterns is not very symmetric. Okay. For the e-hailing providers, I think their best bet is to say how they can encourage people use ride sharing. Okay. Secondly, how they can reduce the vacant trips. That's the 2 strategies they can use. These are the 2 ultimate way they can help to reduce congestion. Of course, how to achieve this can be very diversified, by encouraging people. They can further cut the price if I'm using Uber Pool. I think now if you use Uber Pool, it's only a couple of dollars different, right? At least in my experience. So why bother? I wait like 10 minutes or something, right? So, yeah, question.
So we have a goal of reducing congestion, but the e-hailing companies have a goal of increasing profit.
Yeah.
So are those aligned, or are they the?
Of course not. So that's why we need to have public policy to kind of guide them to do good things. If we don't, then of course, no. They will do. I know this is recorded, but they will do first wipe out the competitors' taxes, and then see what Didi is doing in China now. See, they are increased price.
Reducing deadhead miles is profitable for them, right? So
yeah. Well, some of them. Yeah.
More profitable for them than taking single passengers?
I don't know. But those, I would probably should say, some of their objectives aligned with, some are not. So, again, we need the policies to kind of guide them to do, motivate them to do good things and kind of control the, negative impact of that. Okay, so I hope I'm not disappointing you about this preliminary modeling and results, but this is still ongoing. We discovered there's more things we can do than what we have done. So we're trying to expand things to integrate, for example, the ride sharing services of Whirlpool and other things, and try to integrate transit or make the demand elastic, because we know so far we assume the demand is fixed, but we know that they generate more demand. They kind of compete with other services. And also try to integrate the dynamics of the systems. Everything now is assumed to be kind of static and stable, right? So when urban traffic is always, congestion and, goes, sometimes more, sometimes less. So you have to consider that. And also, as this gentleman mentioned, we have to bring in this, perspectives from a system manager's perspective, like how you can work with them to optimize the system performance, right? So this is also beneficial to the service providers because they have the goal to kind of maximize their current fleet of vehicles. Okay, let's say they have 10,000 cars, taxis, and in the peak hour, more people. They try to figure out a way so that they can be more efficient to kind of pick up or match with customers. And ultimately, we need to test and validate everything in real data and network. So with that, I just show you a figure. This is the DD headquarters in Beijing. So I just visited them maybe a couple weeks ago. We had some nice conversations, and hopefully there's something coming out. They are interested in all those kind of things to help. You may ask me why not Uber or some Lyft, but they're not as open as DD. Yeah, that's what I can say. So with that, I skip those. If you're interested in my lab, in my research, so I'm just quickly go through this. My students, and we have a website, my research, and some of the achievement, but that's kind of less important compared with the talk. So with that, I think I conclude here. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, so the service provider model assumes profit maximization.
Yeah.
However, just this morning I asked my Uber driver if he was going to remain in the city and work or head back to Clackamas. And she says that she prefers not to drive within the city limits, so she has a point in Clackamas where she goes and back every time. And
right.
So how can the model accommodate for these preferences and so-called irrational decisions?
Well, I think that's, I would say, first, that can be done. Secondly, that's a particular consideration of that particular driver. How typical or representative that is something that we need to look into, right? So even that's, a good percentage of drivers have that concern. You can have them, drivers have different groups. Some may not have that limitations, others do, but we need to consider that in our model, have different groups of drivers. And even a driver has that kind of concern. It just adds more constraint to the choices that the driver will make. But still, the ultimate goal for him or her is, with that constraint, they still want to maximize their profit. That's still true. But with that consideration of the constraint, right? I hope that's true. Yeah. Yes.
You explained that taxi drivers influenced by e-hailing, Uber, and other. So there's some kind of like evaluation for this part. How does that e-hailing influence the public transportation, transits, and MAX? And even though in your model you said you will develop it for including that, because the cost time. We know time with transit will be more, but the cost less. That will influence.
Well, I personally haven't done that type of research, but I'm sure there are reports or papers that has been done. I know some researchers at UC Berkeley. I can give you the name, and they have an institute on ride sharing and other services. They might have reports on this. But, I mean, in general, there's a possible competition between transit and e-hailing services. That is kind of generally agreed. But the actual effect has to depend on the actual, kind of services. In many cities, like New York City, I'm not sure how competitive Uber service compared with, subway and others. But in a city, the transit is not good originally, and of course, they are going to wipe up your transit services. So it depends, really. Yeah. Yes?
So the orthodoxy here in Portland is that we provide lots of transportation choices.
Yeah.
And I think some of us hope that if e-hailing increases the range of choices, it may ultimately drive a reduction in auto ownership, at which point it could provide a benefit. So is there any research on where the break point is that you might get a benefit by having people not own cars and using e-hailing instead?
So there are research, but many of those, my understanding is, are not really, based on lots of assumptions regarding people's behavior related to those services. But my first question would be, why reducing the ownership would reduce travel?
Because you move travel from being largely a fixed cost to a variable cost per trip, but therefore the financial incentives are clearer to make different choices to transit, to use bike share, to we have a variety of choices here in Portland.
So I see some research on how the autonomous vehicle will impact the car ownership. That, to my understanding, is more than probably the shared mobility. But yeah, that could be the case. Like if you have but I'm kind of debating between what's that would be, because if you look at the many cities, the current price of Uber doesn't mean that in 5 years it will be the same, right? So because it's way cheaper than what you can imagine. And they already see cases like Didi already increased their prices in China, in Beijing. Now, if you compare this kind of service with taxi, it's not that big difference. So that's, it still remains to be seen, I would say. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. It was a very good presentation. I have a question. Maybe I missed this, but if you compare now you have competition between traditional and e-hailing, but if you have only one system, either traditional or just e-hailing, which one may be better in terms of congestion or BMTs? And the other question is, I think you mentioned at the end extending to elastic demand.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
But I was not clear, maybe you mentioned this in terms of the supply. So in terms of the supply of taxis and e-hailing services.
Oh, you mean the demand?
No, the number of potential taxis and potential Uber drivers that are out there.
Oh, yeah. For now, we assume at least the Uber drivers are sufficiently large, because that's typically the case. Yeah, we didn't incorporate this number of drivers, which we could. I mean, I'm actually working on that. If we add that, then there's additional constraints, because you have this kind of ability or capability to transport this many people. Yeah. Well, in order to answer this question, you could say the old days we only have taxi, right? So we had some kind of congestion, and then some reports, as I just indicated, just published recently, to say the new services mildly increased congestion in the city. Does that mean that if we convert everything to the new services, that will increase congestion? I'm not sure, because there's a time difference. Maybe the population of the city increased. Maybe, some other things impact the congestion pattern. So I would say my best guess is if everything remains the same, then the new services will probably increase congestion, because, ultimately it's cheaper, hopefully still cheaper. It's more convenient. Then more people will use it, right? So more people will use it. Either you increase the total demand of people to use cars, or you kind of reduce the transit usage, right? So I think that's ultimately may translate to the increased congestion, or VMT at least. But I'm not very confident about that, but that's my guess.
Last question. Okay, last question. I think parking both parking costs and availability will be a very important piece of the picture in terms of people's choice between the few different modes, and also potentially affects how drivers, Uber or Lyft drivers, behave when when either they move back to Clackamas, or they are potentially just circling on the highway to avoid paying high cost, or maybe for parking, or maybe there's no parking available, just circling on the city. That could potentially be a very adverse effect.
Yeah, totally agree. The mode I didn't put the fixed cost to the solo drivers, which we could. It's a fixed cost. Actually, in the model we are working on now, we add that cost. Like parking could be one of the important aspects for that. But in terms of the circling for parking, that depends on what kind of trip you're looking at. For the morning commute trip, I highly doubt that would be significant because I'm going to work. I better to have already arranged parking instead of searching around 30 minutes for parking. That doesn't make any sense. But for shopping, entertainment, that could be the case. Yeah.
They could potentially, when they cannot find a spot, they can park and wait for the next passenger. They could potentially just drive around and then instead of parking and stuff.
Well, if they are a driver, they park anywhere, that's, with a driver inside, I think they can do that, right? So they don't need to worry about. Okay.
I suppose. I believe I read some report in San Francisco that actually drivers do that. Instead of find a spot, they can stop and wait for the next passenger.
Just still circling around.
Just circling around.
Okay.
Empty vehicle.
Yeah, this maybe depends on the city. But I would say the chances or the probability is lesser, is just much less compared with the traditional taxis. It's just driving around. Yeah.
Let's thank Jeff again for